Okay, volume 4 of this experiment. It's probably obvious that I'm just freestyling, like riffing off the dome here, like I'm sprawling all over. So if it sounds like a rant, I'm not intending that, but all these ideas I'm just fleshing out in real time, basically, and my intention is to eventually organize them into something more linear, but it's hard to organize them at present because they're all interrelated in a not necessarily linear way, basically. So anyway, so last time I want to get into more like concrete math stuff this time because I'm focusing on abstract ideas the last few times. But yeah, what was I saying last? So Leibniz is the most like illustrative example of optimism bias to me because he is also famously a mathematical genius who contributed like an undeniably critical uh, idea to mathematics, or the framework, which is calculus, along with Newton and Archimedes. Uh, in other words, like, yeah, he's really smart. Like, everybody gets it. You're really smart. However, you can at the same time just be completely oblivious to something they're saying that's insane. It's absurd. And I was talking about Schopenhauer going for the jugular with Kant and Hegel. Well, Voltaire, of course, wrote this famous and deservedly famous and awesome book, Candide, which is just brutally satirical, dark humor that is directed at trying to call Leibniz's attention to how stupid he's being, basically, with regards to his overall qualitative assessment of existence that makes no sense, etc. Anyway, that's all I was getting at with that. And then Philip Mainlander, the main point here. Let's see. I try to take notes so I can actually say something. Yeah, all I was gonna. So Philip Mainlander is a philosopher who, he's a pessimist philosopher. He's one of the most important pessimist philosophers, certainly that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm not claiming to be aware of um, enough, basically, to say any conclusive thing. But like, yeah, to me, he's extremely influential, and he's one of the most important pessimist philosophers, along with Jean Amory and Hegesias, the ancient Greek philosopher. And all of those three people I just mentioned have essentially they articulate it differently, but at the end of the day, what they're saying is, a pessimist conclusion regarding the overall quality of life. It's negative in character. It is in itself irredeemable, and therefore the only form of redemption, to use Philip Mainlander's word, freedom or dignity, to use like Jean Amory's word, and like adequate action or something, to use Hegesias' word. Uh, basically, like the only redemptive feature of life is death, and therefore, they none of them, well, except with the exception potentially of Hegesias, although we don't have his writing, so um, none of them exactly say like everyone just go ahead and kill yourself, but they are implying that effectively, like hint, hint, right? And Philip Mainlander and Jean Amory did kill themselves as a result of their philosophy. Well, I mean, like they expressed their philosophy and then killed themselves, basically. So people consider both of them to be dangerous philosophers in that sense because you run the risk of ending up like them if you read them. That's the idea. And you do. You absolutely do. That's the thing. It's like I can attest to that. And that's going to be a crucial component of my own theory, radical depressive realism. So the idea is you might think like, okay, that's the most extreme form of pessimism. Like many people assume this, that's why they avoid it. It's like it doesn't get any more extreme than that, right? Like as Camus might point out, like, well, if you kill yourself as the result of your philosophy, you're not alive to ask any further philosophical questions, right? So like, there's nothing more extreme. Wrong. Again, Camus is wrong. He's on the right track, but he's ultimately wrong. It does get worse, and the perfect expression of that is Ligotti, specifically, Thomas Ligotti. His book is that expresses his philosophical view. is called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. It's an amazing book. It is the most brutal expression of pessimism that I'm aware of, at least in the English language. Uh, pending what I intend to write, basically. My intention is to write something that's like every bit as brutally dark as Thomas Ligotti, but which also transposes into another mode of thinking. That's the thing. But so why is this worse? Well, because Thomas Ligotti is effectively implying that there is no redemption at all, even in suicide. Even suicide is pointless, right? Which, again, like for all the same reasons that these people were arguing their position, this does logically follow, right? Like Philip Mainlander effectively believed in what we would now call eternal heat death. The teleological, sort of inevitability of the universe due to the law of entropy. As far as we can tell right now, the most plausible end state of the universe that we live in is just nothingness, essentially. Just eternal heat death, like no information, no energy, no matter, no nothing. And that's, every day it seems a little less certain that that's inevitable, right? Like that we can't say that that's the case with 100% certainty at the very least. But Philip Mainlander had like no awareness even of what we would call the law of entropy. Like he was aware of entropy itself, like as it's observable in reality, but he didn't like understand the second law of thermodynamics or anything. And he certainly didn't understand how that would apply to like cosmology. So it's interesting that his philosophy is basically like perfectly in line with what we would now call speculative realism, a 21st century philosophical movement, which is informed by contemporary physics. He's very prescient in that sense, or seemingly, but he doesn't express it in the terms of like natural sciences. He borrows analogies from Christianity because that's the culture he was born into, of course, and that's another reason I like him. I was born into a Christian culture. I appreciate people who like Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and people who will, and Jack Kerouac is another one. People who are heretics, clearly, like myself, but who are willing to engage critically and creatively and, openly with Christian ideas, at least, just because why not, That's what us heretics do. Just a quick aside, somewhere in a box around here, I have a letter, an actual physical letter from a church I was trying to attend when I was in a, like more openly Kierkegaardian Christian absurdist frame of mind. But yeah, I have a formal letter of excommunication for heresy. And the heresy, as is described in the letter, is officially pessimism. Right? So when I talk about pessimism, I try to explain to people, like, I have skin in the game, like I really understand what it is to like push this idea to some kind of limit, even if that limit is like literally excommunication from a church. And I tell people this, and they're like, "What? That still happens? This isn't like 1500 or something. Like, what the hell?" But yeah, that still happens, and I'm honestly glad it happened to me because it was extremely educational, the whole experience. And I could go on and on about that, of course. Anyway, so like this Mainlander, Amari Hegesius, they seem to be the most extreme form of pessimism because all these people presumably killed themselves. I mean, Hegesius we don't know, but like he was arguing supposedly for a pro-suicide position, so that would appear to be the most extreme. However, as Ligotti points out, what if suicide is like this idea that death is redemptive is itself an arbitrary assumption. In other words, there's no reason why we can't suppose that any number of additionally horrifying features of existence will just continue to manifest themselves infinitely for reasons that we can never understand. In other words, he's more informed by Lovecraftian cosmological pessimism, right? Which is a more hardcore version of pessimism because like like you might end up committing suicide, but your suicide in this case will be irrational. And again, this is a key feature of what I refer to as the like a Bayesian theory, a Bayesian inference theory of suicidal reasoning, which will be critically important to my theory here. Yeah, according to that according like the central presupposition of a Bayesian theory of suicidal reasoning would be that there is a distinction, a formal, rigorous distinction between a rational, let me say, an example of rational suicide, I should say, rational suicide and irrational suicide, right? So, like, in Thomas Ligotti's horror fiction, which is incredible, he's like the only horror writer that's like better than Thomas Ligotti potentially is Shirley Jackson, in my opinion. But they're pretty much equal. Like they're just OG badasses of American horror fiction, and both are just like deeply philosophical writers, and they're stylistically fascinating at the same time. It's not like pedantic, you know. But yeah, both of them understand that the worst form of suicide is irrational suicide, where the suiciding person isn't really aware of why they're doing it, right? Like, in other words, like when people say like, "Oh, they weren't in their right mind when they did this," right? Like that's a more tragic form, presumably, of suicide than someone who's like, "No, I'm in my right mind. I'm doing it." You know, like Kurt Cobain or something. You know, it's like, "No, I know exactly why I'm killing myself." Yeah, you know, like you do too. I wrote like a bunch of songs about it. You know? Like not that. In other words, like the worst form would be someone who is not even aware of what they're doing and somehow is doing this anyway. And Shirley Jackson in The Haunting of Hill House like gives the perfect example, in my opinion, of exactly that. But Thomas Ligotti's characters who commit suicide, which are like a lot, like a lot of his stories just end with suicide. Uh, the characters are just the process described in the story is just them losing their mind effectively, and then once they've lost their mind, and then they kill themselves. You know, it's like suicide is just sort of an afterthought in his stories, whereas for Shirley Jackson, it's very much the focus. You know. Anyway, so the question is like, what would be worse than that? Then you know, like, how can you get worse than Lovecraftian cosmological horror? You know, like, surely that's the most extreme. Well, no, and this is my claim anyway. I'm not claiming that I've reached the ultimate limit, but it appears to be so to me. Like, what would be worse than that? Well, if you're not going to commit suicide because it's pointless, or at least you're not going to be convinced of it at any given point, the only reason you would commit suicide is effectively that you just lose your mind and so forth, and you're not aware of what you're doing. If that's the case, you're basically saying you're going to stick around until that happens, right? Like, you're going to be here on Earth. And given that, like, while you're here, you might want to consider that, like, whether you participate in a genocide or not makes a lot of difference, right? Like, whether you own slaves or not, whether you are committing sexual assault or not, whether you are a racist maniac, whether you are, yeah, like what if the process of you losing your mind also involves you becoming a psychopath? You know, like personally, I would rather lose my mind in isolation and end up killing myself in a state of confusion than lose my mind in the way that Ted Bundy did. You know what I mean? Like, surely one of these is preferable here, right? Like, so that's, you know, you want to get down to business here, basically, which is like, in my theory, effectively, there are only two forms of reasoning, really, in the world. Well, I mean, you can subdivide these infinitely, obviously, but the two forms that I'm focusing on are basically suicide versus genocide. To me, these are like antithetical notions, right? In other words, people who are committing genocide are survivalists. Like, they want to survive, they want to be immortal, they want to be the victors. The last thing they want to do is commit suicide, which is why Adolf Hitler's like, you know, the most embarrassing feature of his life of like just moral catastrophe is the fact that he committed suicide, right? Like, he was supposed to be the immortal, you know, Führer and all this shit, and also he said that committing suicide was an act of weakness, basically. Which is all, you know, it's like, yeah, he was wrong about literally just everything, you know, like, anyway, yeah, in other words, like, that's the problem, is like, so you have to choose, in other words, in my theory, between suicide and genocide. As I see it, there's a very obvious choice. However, If it's so obvious, why do people continue even this day, like even as I'm speaking, to choose genocide instead of just killing themselves? Right? Like why? This should be obvious, but it's not. So what's going on? Well, you have again, like, so if you choose genocide, off you go. I guess. Like I'm not really, I'm not your guy. I guess for that. you know, see Donald Trump at all. Netanyahu and Putin or whatever. You'll find each other. I'm not your guy. So let's assume that you're sane enough to realize that suicide, tragic as it is preferable to participating in a genocide. Uh, but then you also perceive that it's pointless. In other words, you also reach this level of reasoning. Then what? In other words, like if you're concluding that participating in society is to at some level participate in genocide, no matter what you do, effectively, like you're surrounded by, into the past, into the future, and right now in the present, you're surrounded by like a causal field of behaviors that are all effectively like resulting in genocide eventually. Like you can't separate yourself from this. Like I'm a United States American citizen, right? Well, I'm only here due to like a genocidal history that's there's like a couple genocides on this continent that are the basis for me even being a citizen here. Like, so that's the past, right? In the present, my government is funding a genocide, at least one, and they're using taxpayer money, which like I've worked in this society, so like I technically contributed to a genocide just by working and trying to survive in this society. In other words, by participating in society, I was contributing to a genocide. So like, fuck. Like, what the fuck do you do? In other words, like that's why I start to feel quite suicidal. Is like, if you cannot separate yourself from, human institutions, civilizational systems, and so forth, like just society in general, if you cannot like separate yourself from this, how do you stop participating in a genocide, even if you're just doing nothing, like without just killing yourself? In other words, yeah, you can be, you could just like accept homelessness and also just starve intentionally and just sit there and starve, right? Like you could do that. Well, that's committing suicide, right? Like, and that's pointless. We concluded. Like, what if there is no redemption in even that? Like, what do we do, right? So, like, if you're accepting that you're going to be sticking around, this is where things get interesting, essentially, to me, like, really interesting, which is you're going to have to deal with some basics. In other words, like, yeah, if you're participating in a genocide, inevitably, don't participate in it actively and passively, just like, or passively, I guess. Like try to minimize the effect of this participation at the very least. It would appear that that's the best you can do, right? And so this reasoning is very simple. Like a lot of what I have to say has to do with a three-part loop, essentially, or a three-part construction, which is the same as in metamathematics or in like set theory. You would think of it as a zero case, a successor case, and a limit case. I'm going to like refer to that sequence of ideas many times. And, the concept of 0, 1, infinity kind of aligns with this. The concept of 0, positive, negative aligns with this. And the concept of the three stages of suicidal reasoning, as I see them, which have to do with the three features of fear of death. Like, we don't just fear death in some abstract sense. We fear specifically the irreversibility and the inevitability of death. In other words, just like the finality of you not being around anymore eternally. And we fear the painfulness of the dying process. And then we fear the unpredictability of death, the fact that you could die at any time for reasons that you had no ability to foresee. And they could be horrifying, and you don't know, right? So that's what it breaks down into. And then I'll get to like the suicidal reasoning that corresponds to those three levels. But for now, like radical depressive realism can't, like the ultimate point is like, okay, one, suffering, abuse / pain. One, these are all effectively the same thing. If you exist, you are both well, you're a victim of abuse, and to the extent that you survive long enough to harm anyone else directly, like you're a perpetrator of abuse, of course. Um, and really, even in the sense that like a baby can like bite their mother's breast or their nipple like too hard without even knowing it and like cause them pain, right? Like that is a form of abuse, right? The baby's obviously not aware of what they're doing, but that's the whole thing. It's like this is just a continuum of just awful, right? Like we all know what this is. It sucks. So yeah, one, suffering, pain, abuse, that's bad. Like let's just agree that that's bad. Can we like get on that page? Okay, if you agree that, like, how about we stop adding slash multiplying slash like exponentiating slash hyper exponentiating to the infinite suffering. Like, just stop making everything the worst it could possibly be until everything is hell on earth and we're all dying and then finally we're dead. Like, why don't we just not do that? Like, that's the next obvious step. And if while you're doing that, if you get around to it, like maybe start minimizing suffering towards infinitely approaching the limit of zero. So again, we have 0 plus negative. This is this 3-part pattern essentially that it's the same pattern, but I'm perceiving it in different contexts, and that's going to be a recurring theme. Anyway, that's just kind of a look ahead. Man, I'm already running out of time. Yeah, the other thing I said last time was that like both nihilism and pessimism are forms of optimism bias in my theory. And it's like at first that sounds very confusing or nonsensical. Like how can that be? Specifically, how can pessimism be a form of optimism bias, right? Like how does that work? Well, it has to do with this hierarchy of things, basically. Like, okay, like optimism, Leibniz, right? Like the downside is that you're just a narcissistic, oblivious idiot, right? So like if you start paying attention, you're liable to become a nihilist. Examples would be like Derrida is an important example. Many Buddhist examples of Buddhism. I don't want to say like Buddhist philosophers per se, but just Buddhist views are effectively nihilistic. In therapy, I've been told many times everything's 50-50. I don't agree with this, of course, but everything's neutral, right? Nihilism, like no meaning. Anyway, like yeah, nihilism is comparatively negative relative to optimism in the sense that you forsake joy, like abandon all hope ye who enter here. But so nihilism is an example of optimism bias relative to pessimism. In other words, the appeal of nihilism is that you also get to avoid the negative and just giving a shit and like suffering in any abstract way where you care about other people and so forth. For more on that, see Nietzsche. But yeah, so how can pessimism then be an optimism bias? Well, pessimism, again, it has to do with this conviction of both, the mainlander level of pessimism and the Legati level, which is that, you think the worst thing that could happen is just that you live. Basically, that like life is the worst thing that could happen, and therefore death is preferable and it's redemptive because it cancels this worst case thing, which is being alive at all, right? You think that's as bad as it gets. And then Legati comes along and says, no. Even suicide is pointless. There is no redemption. It gets even worse. And then I come along and I say, no. Legati, are you going to tell me it makes, like, no difference whether you participate in genocide actively or not? Like, obviously, it gets worse, man. Right? So my point is, like, pessimism, from my perspective, is a form of optimism bias because it's avoiding things like evaluating to what extent you are actually participating in abuse, even if you are a pessimist, antinatalist, I just stay alone, I don't avoid the world, I'm a hermit or something, right? I mean, see Ted Kaczynski, basically. Like, he was horrifically victimized in his life. And he was a mathematical genius. It's another example of someone who's, like, obviously capable of high level of rational thought. However, he underwent a great deal of psychological abuse at Harvard, another reason to not trust any fucking school anywhere, right? Like you got someone who's as brilliant as Ted Kaczynski, and you did what? You just traumatized him into madness. Yeah, Harvard, the hallowed halls. Like fuck off. Anyway, so he became a hermit, right? And yeah, things went bad. It's just like he was avoiding society. He was convinced that like, okay, I need to remove myself from technological society and all these institutions. In other words, he was coming to something of the conclusion that I have been coming to my whole life, and it was just like, this is all bullshit. Like, this is clearly like, I don't want to participate in this. But then what? He went off the goddamn rails and started like mailing bombs to people that had nothing to do with anything he's talking about effectively, or at least not any more so than anyone else, including him. Like, there's just no rational reason for bombing the people he did. I mean, like supposedly he sent these bombs to people based on like what like the street they lived on was named after a tree, and that tree genus happened to be like the tree outside of his hermit hut or whatever. It's just like, so like you went from being like highly rational to being just completely fucking insane. Obviously, like, yeah, things get worse. In other words, Thomas Gotti, like Ted Kaczynski, agreed with almost everything that we're saying, and then he just look what happened. Like it can get worse. Uh, yeah. So then the question is like, is this a loop? In other words, like, okay, I became an optimist, or I started off as an optimist. Everything's great. Things aren't so great. Okay, maybe it's just 50-50, maybe nihilism, but I don't want to go full out pessimist. And then it's like, more evidence has come in. I have to conclude everything is irredeemably bad. Like even suicide is pointless. And it's like, actually, are you just like, don't murder, don't commit slavery, racism, so like make sure you're trying to take care of innocent children rather than allow them to just be abused without intervening. And so like, hey, it gets worse, right? And so this is why I call this realism. It's like the reality is this whole process, and that it's irresolvable. In other words, like you can't escape this. Like each of these is trying to escape the others. And my position is like, no, you can't. It's inescapable. It's irresolvable. And then the question is it a loop? Like, do you loop from my position back through? And I would suspect the answer is yes, right? Like, and that it's basically, in other words, we are all subject. It's a recurring feature in my theory. This thinking is a loop, which is actually a degenerative spiral, right? Like, in other words, it's a loop conceptually. However, given the fact that it's manifested in a finite organism, a human being, it can't, there's an energy supply issue, which is that like you can cycle infinitely in theory through this loop again, but like, so you have the actual infinity of this conceptual process and the actual finitude of the degenerative effect of entropy on the person thinking of it. In other words, you can only maintain this for so long. Right. So, yes, I would say it is a loop. However, this stage of the loop is the most extreme. Again, that's why I call it radical depressive realism, because we're dealing with extreme things, and also heads up, it's inevitably depressing, and you will have to engage suicidal reasoning in order to understand any of this. This is my warning. I think this is an ethical choice. In other words, like, warning, warning, if you don't want to be depressed, just don't read this. This is my abandon all hope, ye who enter here, right? And then realism, which is like, that's the stage ultimately of what I'm claiming is the actual extreme. There are plenty of examples of bullshit realism that just is just optimism, basically. But that's not what I'm talking about in my view, right? So, man, I'm not going to get to the math, am I? But just a quick aside, in Dante's Divine Comedy, which is where that phrase "abandon all hope, ye who enter here," right? That's what's written on like the gates of hell in the Inferno, the first book, where Virgil is taking Dante on the tour, the tour of everything. And what's interesting is that anyone who's actually read the whole Divine Comedy, like all three books, which I haven't spent a lot of time studying it or anything. I enjoy it. It's like really influential in my thinking. Especially like, look, like three tiers, right? Like this whole three structure really comes from Dante. That's like why I'm tending to think of that, although I believe it's based in mathematics. Like ultimately it's the zero case, successor case, limit case deep down, but like Dante is an example of that thinking as I see it. But anyway, anyone who's read the whole thing understands that like the Inferno is the only really interesting book. Like that's why it's referred to all the time and the other ones are like never mentioned. It's because Purgatory and Paradise are not dramatically interesting, it turns out. And Dante had a hell of a time. Like that's why it's so impressive. Is like how did he like even bother to try to keep this interesting after writing the Inferno, which is like you max out. Like that's as interesting as it gets. Like meeting Satan in a like sea of ice at the center of hell. You know, it's like it doesn't get more interesting than this in the rest of the book. But the really interesting part to me is that the circles of hell start out weak, you know, like the least painful, and then they get more painful and more painful, and right, like they get worse the deeper you go on these concentric circles. And like obviously he would have to structure it that way because it would be boring to begin with the worst thing and then have it get less intense and less intense and like you know, this is not interesting. Like you have to build right to the worst. But according to radical depressive realism, the whole point is that you are in hell, right? Like you can't escape. Cognitive bias is simply like the acknowledgement that the brain is irreparably broken